All right, well, I think we'll get started. Welcome very much to the 7th Arctic Resilience Forum session. It's hard to believe we've been doing this now for so long, but it's been a really amazing experience. To start off, I'm going to do a little housekeeping. So first of all, at the bottom of your screen, you should see a globe that says interpretation. We have both English and Russian available for you today, so you should pick the language of your choice. We will have some interpretation happening, and so make sure that if you're an English speaker, you're on the English channel, Russian on the Russian channel. We also invite questions from the audience today, so you'll see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to use that at any time. And our moderators will do our best to bring some of those questions into the discussion. Today, we're also going to be doing some polling. Again, you'll see something at the bottom of your screen come up when there's the polling happening. So please feel free to be involved in that. And I just also will remind you about our Slack channel. So once this gets going, if you'd like to be part of a longer conversation, we invite you to join us on the Slack channel. So far, we've had some amazing sessions that draw out issues that are of critical importance to Arctic communities. We've talked about Indigenous youth leadership, food security, renewable energy, human health, broadband connectivity, and gender. The videos from these sessions are all available on the SDWG, the Sustainable Development Working Group YouTube channel. So we invite you to check those out and see some of the great conversations we've had already. These sessions have tackled some of the biggest challenges facing the Arctic, and we've also had a glimpse of the vibrant and strong peoples and communities across the circumpolar region. These sessions have underlined that resilience is a powerful tool to see the interconnections that are so important to see and recognize that you can't deal with one issue without the other. Today's session, we're going to continue down the path of recognizing the importance of interconnections. Today, we are taking a closer look at how resilience depends on understanding the intimate relationship between Arctic communities and ecosystems. The Arctic is experiencing rapid and dramatic changes due to climate change, and this means that the resilience of socio-ecological systems is critical. I would like to introduce Marcus Carson, who's a senior research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute, and Tatiana Minayeva, at the Russian Academy of Science and the Institute of Forest Science, who will be your co-chairs for today's session. Take it away, guys.
Marcus, you're muted.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer. Thank you for that. I will go ahead and run some slides here. So on behalf of my colleagues working on wetlands and I, Tatiana and I, welcome. We're really happy to have you here joining us for the session on social ecological systems and resilience. And I would like to start by relating this session to the broader sequence of topics that Jennifer just ran through within the Arctic Resilience Forum. I think it was Joel Clement who mentioned earlier that the previous sessions focused primarily on social aspects of social ecological systems in the Arctic. And in this session, we want to shift that emphasis a little bit or expand it to include Arctic ecosystems, in particular, wetland ecosystems and the life-supporting links between people and Arctic wetlands. So the way we think about a place influences pretty strongly how we engage with it. And this picture is how many people around the world picture the Arctic. So if you're joining this forum, you know that this is only a small piece of the truth. But if this is your picture, the Arctic is beautiful and dramatic, but generally a place far away to be avoided or maybe exploited. This picture comes from the US's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And if it's true that the way we think about a place heavily influences the way we engage with it, we need to also keep in mind that this influence works in both directions. Here, this refuge has been the focus of a major dispute for many, many years, but especially right now, because people perceive its value and its meaning very differently. If you see this as your ancestral homeland, an area where you hunt for food and raise your children, you'll approach it in one way. If you see it instead as a largely unused space endowed with underground riches, you'll treat it in a whole different way. And those different ways of understanding guide different ways of interaction and or exercising stewardship over the land. They also have very different consequences, both for the ecosystems and for the people, and in both the short term and the long term. Many of you have seen this diagram before. It represents the framework used for the Arctic Resilience Report a few years back and the Arctic Resilience Action Framework, which provided the basis for this forum. It's one way of picturing these combined systems of people and nature together as part of a single system or social ecological system. And at a very simple level, it highlights how we receive benefits from ecosystems, ecosystem services, and how our actions impact those ecosystems. And especially importantly, how those actions have consequences, both for the ecosystems, but also that consequences that ultimately come back to further benefit us or to haunt us. This model is something you're also probably familiar with, the Sustainable Development Goals. And when I say haunt us, I mean that in the long run, we are utterly dependent on functioning ecosystems. So many of you will remember an earlier version of the Sustainable Development idea that had environment, economy, and society represented as three equal pillars. This representation, I think, is better because it shows economy as a part of society rather than separate and equal. And it also shows how we sit on the biosphere or how our dependency on nature connects. So in this session of the forum, we focus on a particular type of Arctic ecosystem, that's wetlands. They're incredibly important, but for much of the past 2 centuries, people have seen wetlands as unusable, largely wasted, maybe even dangerous. This understanding began to shift in the 1960s and 70s, also leading to the signing of the Ramsar Convention. But old mistaken ways of understanding wetlands have persisted. And as just one example, in the English-speaking world, at least, many politicians across the political spectrum still use the drain the swamp phrase as a campaign slogan. And that ranges in the US as one example from Nancy Pelosi a few years ago to Donald Trump more recently. But what we see here is that wetlands constitute a huge portion of the Arctic. Depending on which definition you use, it's typically well over half. And it's different kinds of wetlands, from rivers and ponds, shorelines, and peatlands in particular. So the services that we enjoy from wetlands are quite broad. Water, culture, traditional livelihoods, biodiversity. Many of these services are very local, and you'll hear more about them later in the thematic sessions that we have. But for the moment, I want to focus on one that's especially important and global in scope. There is a shocking amount of carbon stored in wetlands and particularly peatlands in the Arctic. Permafrost is also a worrisome source of carbon emissions. But in Sweden, for example, 20% of our emissions come from degraded wetland areas, more than half of Iceland's, quite a substantial amount in Canada, the US, Norway. So the impact on climate change is quite large, and the wetlands is degraded wetlands as a source of carbon emissions. So the sub-themes of today's session bring us back to this social ecological systems dimension and the question of stewardship, making use of wetlands ecosystem services while caring for the ecosystem to ensure that it remains resilient. We have 3 themes in focus, one being restoration. Can we restore the damage already done? How can we prioritize? That'll be led by my co-chair here, Dr. Tatiana Miniyeva. The second is wetland stewardship and how can we better balance conservation and use. That'll be led by Professor Linur Oskarsson with Casey Burns and Anna Maria Persson with the Sami Council. And the third will be around engagement and co-management and the question of how we can ensure that affected communities, especially indigenous communities, are fundamentally part of the stewardship process with decision-making, balancing use and conservation, and ensuring resilience. And that session will be led by Victoria Bushman and Stanislav. And Stanislav, I'm not going to pronounce your name because I know I'll make it wrong here, but I know you'll follow up. So this is all a part of a bigger pair of projects, one housed at CAF on Arctic wetland resilience, and another that is funded through the Belmont Forum called Arctic Wetlands Ecosystems Resilience through Restoration and Stewardship. There's quite an array of different participants in the project, including the Harvard Belfer Center and CAF and several others that and people who are participating in the forum here today. And our key questions for today that I would like for you to take with you or to keep in mind as we go through the thematic sessions are how do we strengthen wetland stewardship? How do we push Arctic wetlands resilience up higher on the agenda? It's moving up, but it's moving up way too slowly. And what kind of recommendations can we develop both for CAF and for the Arctic Council to prioritize wetland resistance for taking action? So with that in mind, I will pass the screen back to my co-chair here, or our co-chair, Tatiana Minieva, to talk about wetlands restoration and some of the challenges and interesting elements of that. So Tatiana, it's all yours.
Thank you, Marcus. Yeah, really, we want that you come out of the session with understanding that wetlands is not something dirty, wet, and unpleasant, full of mosquitoes, but this is really, really the place and the ecosystem type which can help us to enhance our resilience. And when we are losing our wetlands, we are losing resilience. That's why if we find out that we are losing too many of wetlands, so then we have to restore them. And I really ask you to put your questions to Q&As, and we will make some breaks in order to answer your questions. And also there will be some the two polls which we would like to answer, and Brittany will put this polls while I am speaking, as I understood. And to introduce you to the topic, at first I would like to share with you a story from Julia from Myanmar in a short film which she produced for us. It is in Russian.
Привет, это я, меня зовут Юля. И это тоже я. Я измеряю температуру почвы в тундре. Это мой дом, поселок Искателей, около Нарьян-Мара, в Ненецком автономном округе в России. Это моя река Печора, а это моя тундра, она очень красивая. А это моя любимая ягода морожка, она растет в тундре. По латыни род морожки называется рубус. Это мои друзья Сергей и Алексей. Они создали организацию «Рубус». Руслан много лет охраняет природу нашего округа вместе со своей командой «Эко-Норд». Это мои сограждане. У нас живут ненцы и коми. Они пасут оленей, ловят рыбу и охотятся. Здесь добывают нефть и приезжают на работу много людей из других частей России. У нас есть свой заповедник – Ненецкий. Всем этим людям, так же как и мне, не безразлично, что наша тундра разрушается и превращается в пустыню. Сначала разрушения кажутся небольшими, но после ухода нефтяников здесь часто остается голый песок. Дожди и ветер размывают и разносят песок, и нарушенный участок разрастается, и вот, его уже можно видеть из космоса. Дороги и тропинки быстро превращаются в глубокие овраги. Протайки вдоль трубопроводов становятся реками, в которых плавают трубы с риском аварии. Мои друзья говорят, что очень важно понять, что происходит с нашей тундрой, какие процессы стоят за тем, что мы видим, только тогда можно попытаться что-то исправить. К К нам приезжают специалисты из разных городов России и всего мира изучать нашу тундру. Мы узнали, что при нарушениях в тундре меняется гидрология, тает мерзлота. В мерзлоте содержится много органического вещества. При ее таянии начинают выделяться парниковые газы. Это приводит к потеплению, которое без того угрожает Арктике. А еще органическое вещество из мерзлоты попадает в реки. Местные жители давно заметили, что рыба стала другая. Многие виды пропали из улова, появились новые, совсем непривычные. Мы помогаем отбирать пробы воды в реках в разные сезоны и на разных участках, чтобы подтвердить эти наблюдения. В 2015 году ребята решили провести эксперимент и восстановить участок тундры после того, как оттуда ушли нефтяники. Не просто засеять травой, а попробовать восстановить настоящую тундру. Создали разные препятствия на склонах, чтобы дать растениям закрепиться и задержать таяние мерзлоты. С помощью простых сооружений остановили эрозию во врагах, помогли зарасти ручью. В этом году мне повезло. Меня включили в команду исследователей, которые приехали проводить мониторинг процессов восстановления на нашем экспериментальном участке. У нас отличная команда, и я рада, что могу работать спасателем тундры. По-моему, это очень важная и нужная работа. Нарушений в тундре много, и наша небольшая команда не может везде успеть. Но мы хотим показать, что восстановление экосистем в Арктике возможно. Присоединись к нашему отряду спасателей тундры. Распространите это видео. Нас найти легко.
So that's what it, and I hope you understand now the problem which is behind this. If you have, yes, the poll is supposed to happen now. So there's the questions of the poll.
And I promise to read through these questions to give Tatiana just a moment's break.
Yeah.
So the question is, to cope with the challenges of climate change in the Arctic, which strategies would you be most likely to rely on? And just fill out the poll.
Okay, so, and I proceed, I think that I can proceed to presentation. I don't know if you see my presentation really.
Tatiana, Nelson here. For some reason, I can't complete this. Possibly, it says a host and panelist cannot vote.
Yes, that's true. That's true. The host and panelist can't vote. Yes, this is true. So, and we go ahead and I will explain you some more about wetlands and why they are so significant for us. So I will, yes. So if you see now my screen, that's okay. So first of all, I would like to introduce you wetlands and why they are so significant to us and what is the secret in them, because they are really themselves resilient. These are the most resilient ecosystems in the world if we don't disturb them. Because wetlands, and specifically here we show this on the example of peatlands, they consist from three elements: water, peat, and plants. And these three elements, they maintain each other. When there's too many water, oh, do you see my screen? No. Sorry for this inconsistency. So share.
We see your screen now.
Okay, so do you see the screen? Okay,
yes.
So here I just wanted to describe, explain that these wetlands, they are like the perpetuum mobile. Yeah? supporting themselves. As long as there's water, there's special plants. These plants are depositing peat. They don't decompose, and they turn to the peat. And this peat is bringing more water. More water bring more plants. More plants bring more peat bring more water. And this is such a cycle. This is why we consider peatlands and other wetlands where a lot of organic is accumulating as the most resilient ecosystem in the world. This is really miracle. Yeah, this is secret of the wetlands, and that's why we pay so much attention to wetlands. And this is going for thousands and thousands of years. But when we change this, it can dramatically change just in 10 years. So thousands of years, this ecosystem exists in the same status, maintaining environment, maintaining itself, and then we ruin it, and then we lose all carbon which is accumulated for thousands of years, all water and all system. And this is not good. So, and the other secret of wetlands is that in Arctic, really, people didn't recognize that we have wetlands. And especially that they didn't recognize that there is a lot of ecosystem services. We call this Cinderella syndrome, because people think that, oh, this is something dirty, something not pleasant. But in reality, these ecosystems have a lot of treasures, really, really a lot of treasures in it, which we don't know about. For example, do you know that the most of habitats of birds, migrating birds, are wetlands? And it's not only in the Arctic, but all over the world. So in Arctic, conserving wetlands, which are habitats of birds, you conserve the bird population of the other areas. So this is how Arctic is connected with the other world, through the birds who are living in wetlands. And this is one of the Cinderella features, one of the treasures which we didn't know and we don't think about. There's others. Marcus already mentioned carbon, but not only carbon in the peat itself or wet organic matter itself, but the carbon and permafrost. And the organic matter, the vegetation of wetlands, peat, they protect permafrost from thawing. Protecting permafrost from thawing, we protect carbon from the going out to the atmosphere, warming up our climate even more. The other is capacity to maintain water regime. Peatlands and wetlands keep water in, prevent flooding, they clean water, they discharge water when it's needed, and they keep the surplus of water. So this, the whole value for the landscape water regime. And this is the other Cinderella treasure which we have. So, and here I would like to stop and look at the questions. And if possible, can we launch the second poll? Marcus, would you be so kind to read the second poll?
I sure will. To cope with the challenges of climate change in the Arctic, which strategies would you be most likely to use?
This is the first one. The second was about the driving force in the wetlands ecosystem restoration funding.
Okay, now I see it. We had two poll questions jumping around here. What would be the most important reason for being able to secure funding for wetlands ecosystem restoration in your region? First being global climate change. The second is protection of global biodiversity. The third is water management at the catchment regional level. And the third is local ecological security and livelihoods. Thank you.
So, and I see the questions here. Restoring degraded tundra and actually all degraded ecosystems is clearly essential, but slow and often expensive. Would it not be preferable to limit the degradation of tundra as much as possible. Yes, indeed, it will be. But at the moment, the amount of accumulated and disturbed ecosystem is already really frightening, especially in the Russian north, where there's we inherited a lot from the exploration in the 80s. So-called accumulated harm to tundra, and to stop this distributing of this damages, about which I don't know if you followed this film Julia was telling, like for example in Nenets, we have to fix it. We really have to fix it. And the ecosystem services which we will secure are really worth of this expensive maybe measures. And if you go for ecological restoration, yes, it is long, but after several years already you can little bit fix the problem. So I don't see any other questions yet. The Ramsar Convention, yes, it is addressing Cinderella syndrome. That's true, and that's why CAF and Ramsar Convention had the agreement. So I go ahead a little bit about the climate incentives. What could be incentives in reality to address to address this problem of restoration. We have all this, we know this Paris Agreement came in force, and the most of countries did submitted their NDCs, so-called national determined contributions. Recently, Wetlands International, with some partners, launched recommendations how to bring wetland restoration under the NDCs, how you can report on wetlands restoration under climate, and this could be one of incentives to restore wetlands. If we see the landscape with wetlands, we can plot, map the wetland uses against the wetland distribution, and every wetland type reacts different on different land uses from point of view of climate. Some are enhancing emissions, some uses, the other dissolved organic carbon to the waters, the other acidification of the ocean or the nitrate in the water. So it would be good to have idea how your wetland is reacting on this disturbance. And this you can address from point of view of emissions, but also for ecosystem services, because national determined contribution has two sides. One is mitigation of climate change, and this mitigation of climate change is reduction of emissions. And the other is adaptation. And this exactly adaptation you can calculate through ecosystem services. So when you have natural ecosystem, you have so and so proportion of the ecosystem services related to water, to biota, or to soil, carbon, etc. When you destroy your ecosystem, you have certain losses. When you restore your ecosystem, you have gains. And the main is to calculate these gains and to report on them, and then you win the prize. So you can do this also on the level of your region or your lease if you are the company, and then you can report your double win, yeah, win-win, mitigation and adaptation, and this is the winner. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I convince you that we have to restore wetlands this or that way, and this is your questions now. Marcus, maybe you can answer some questions?
Yes, I'm looking here through the questions that have come in, some good ones. And let me take those up before looking over at the poll, which is also quite interesting.
Yes, so the best is local ecological security and livelihoods. Yes, that's true. I support this.
Yeah, and I guess you could say that in terms of the responses, it's roughly even, but less, and this is probably true of the Arctic, it's less likely to be water management because there are fewer communities to be affected than there are further south. But certainly climate change and biodiversity are key areas. That would be consistent with what you said, wouldn't it, Tatiana?
Yeah, that's great. And I think that now Hlynur with the team can take over and show like these incentives which we mentioned could be managed in the stewardship and further Victoria and the stewardship, and Hlynur can take over, yeah?
Sure. We can pass it over to Hlynur and Anna Maria and Casey to talk a little bit about, actually it comes into this these earlier questions, one being restoring degraded tundras is often slow and it's expensive, and the clear clear goal there is to avoid making those mistakes in the first place. So what Hlynur, Casey, and Anna Maria will talk about a little bit is this struggle between different kinds of uses. Some of those uses are more likely to keep the systems intact than others, and even when they cause problems, there are ways to manage those, but we need to be much more systematic about those. So Hlynur, I'll pass it over to you now.
Okay, thank you, Marcus. Yes, I will begin with a short presentation, then followed by input from Casey Burns and Ann-Maria Persson. Let's see if I can share my screen here. Oops, wait a little bit. Oops, like this. And do you see my screen now?
Yes, great. We can see your screen.
Yes, thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Okay. Yes, so the second topic of land use and stewardship. So I'll be discussing balancing land uses and conservation of natural resources. Aside from climate change, the destruction of habitat stemming from human land use, with the associated loss of biodiversity and ecosystem functioning and services, is, at least in my view, our greatest global environmental problem. And it is evident that the ever-increasing human need for land is unlikely to be reduced in near future. And it is equally evident that the creation of national parks and alike, although they are very good, is not going to suffice to conserve global biodiversity and ecosystems and their services. The challenge, hence, in front of us is therefore to ensure that at the same time as we use the land, we have to make certain that we maintain all the natural resources inherent in the land. Now, this requires a drastic change in our perspective, of course. Our approach to land use must be grounded in the perception that maintenance of the natural resources of the land is our first and foremost priority. And hence, the question to all of us is, with increasing human activity and development in the Arctic, how do we accomplish this in terms of the Arctic, in terms of Arctic wetlands in particular? And as Marcus noted in his his introduction or his presentation, history tells us that as areas get populated with humans, wetlands suffer. So as human activity and development increases in the Arctic, how can we accomplish, how can we change our perspective? Well, I don't have a list of of things or how we can do that, but I will give you an example from Iceland. It's in Ramsar, the University, Agricultural University of Iceland, that I'm positioned at, which demonstrates an attempt of striking a balance between land use and conservation. And it's the Untitled wetland complex. And here's the view of the area, or part of the area. It's a mixture of various types of wetlands, and it is abundant. The bird life of the area is abundant. There are over 40 species of birds that are there that utilize the area, but it's particularly important in terms of the threatened Greenland white-fronted goose. But aside from the importance of the site for biodiversity, it's also important, very important in terms of various ecosystem functions and services. But within the area, there are also 6 active farms. There's actually 13 different landowners, and there are 6 active farms with both managed hayfields and grazing areas. And additionally, the main campus of the Agricultural University of Iceland is located right in the center of the area. But in 2009, the Icelandic government, along with the university and 12 other landowners, nominated the Untitled wetland complex as a Ramsar site. And in 2013, the area was designated as a Ramsar site. Following the designation as a Ramsar site, the university has restored some wetlands within the area and has plans for additional restoration activities. And the university has also established a visitor center for educating and receives people, and there's various bird watching trips and so on that we carry out. But not only that, it's also used very much for university level education, because we use the area to demonstrate how we can balance conservation and land use, that we can use the area, but at the same time maintain all the natural resources of the area. So just to summarize, the Ramsar designation limits development of the site and aids in the conservation of the wetlands and the biodiversity of the area. But at the same time, the site has multiple uses. It's used for education, food production, and recreation. Okay, so that was my input, and I wanted to, so I would love to hear your response to that. But so next we'll hear then from Casey Burns from the Bureau of Land Management in Alaska, input on mining and biodiversity. So go ahead, Casey.
All right, thank you. Let me share my screen here. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Yep.
Great, thank you. All right, well, hello, I'm Casey Burns. I am a wildlife biologist with the United States Bureau of Land Management, and I live in Anchorage, Alaska. And I'll be sharing today briefly about the Arctic Council CAF's mainstreaming biodiversity into Arctic mining project. It's another example of taking multiple uses of the landscape, but also maintaining ecosystem function and biodiversity as part of that. So mainstreaming is a term that's familiar to some in some parts of the world and less familiar to others, especially in the US. It doesn't seem to be as common of a term to use. I put the definition from the Convention of Biological Diversity up there on the slide, but the way I think of it is considerations for biodiversity and conservation as in every part of the process of what you're doing. So in terms of planning, implementation, for mining, afterwards for reclamation, ingress and egress, offsite effects like shipping and processing, consideration of biodiversity is incorporated into all of that at every stage. So why was mining chosen for this process here? Well, it goes back to the Arctic Biodiversity Assessment from CAF in 2013, which identified mainstreaming as one of 6 priorities. And as the mainstreaming priority was very broad, we decided to start with mining first, because mining has an increasing interest across the Arctic as access to mineral resources is increasing across the Arctic with greater ice-free areas and time. Mining is a large economic driver in the Arctic, especially regionally. Its potentially has impacts to biodiversity, so it's an important industry to consider mainstreaming on. There's interested partners with mining companies and other involved parties that are interested in working with CAF on this project. And there's many good examples to share. There's a lot of case studies out there, and people in the mining industry are eager to share some of the good things that they're doing as well. So as part of this process, starting in early 2018, we decided to do phase 1, which hosted 6 roundtable dialogues in Alaska, Finland, and Sweden, which produced this challenges and solutions report. And the report has potential actions for mainstreaming for the mining industry, for governments, and for CAF. And it also has many case studies in it as well. I'll share the link to that in a few minutes. We're currently working on phase 2 of the MBAM project, which will come up with a specific implementation plan, which will have prioritized actions and tangible steps to achieve those actions. We're working through finalizing our 3 input gathering mechanisms. As you can guess, we've changed from in-person workshops, which was our original plan, to more remote input gathering and communication as part of phase 2. We did a panel discussion last week. We are doing interviews and we're doing an online feedback gathering, which I'll share the link also in a minute. Our final report is expected in May 2021. So the next steps in this process, we've been reaching out to Arctic indigenous communities and other local communities around the Arctic. We want to make sure we have products that are useful and beneficial for the local communities. So we'll continue to do that with an increased emphasis on that as we move forward. And moving into phase 3, which was basically an implementation phase of the implementation plan that we're currently developing to mainstream biodiversity. And we're looking at potentially other industry mainstreaming efforts moving forward as well, oil and gas, recreation, and there's many others to consider as well. One of the things I want to emphasize with this project that's been really valuable is it's not just the products. Yes, we have reports that are tangible products at the end of but the process is what's been really important. The sitting down at the table or virtually sitting down with folks and having these conversations outside of a specific mine application or proposal to really talk about things in a less pressure, less stress environment. We've built relationships and we've really had some opportunities to talk with folks that have never maybe interacted before. So that's been a really great part of this effort. In terms of Arctic resilience and the mainstreaming biodiversity and Arctic mining project, mainstreaming is an important consideration because the impacts to biodiversity, wetlands in the Arctic are going to be from a lot of the besides climate change, a lot of the impacts will be from potential activities like mining, oil and gas, and recreation. So we want to work with those industries as much as possible to balance those uses with the conservation and ecosystem function on the landscape. So how can you be involved? We do have an online feedback form. So if you are involved in mining or live in the Arctic, we encourage you to look at that. We'll put it in the chat box. We'll be doing a public event with the Wilson Center in about May 2021. And if you have an organization or interest in implementing this with us, please get in touch. My contact information is at the bottom. And again, I'll post all these links in the chat box. I'll be around for questions and discussion coming up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Casey. On to Anna Maria Persson from the Sami Council, which will be discussing conflicting uses and conservations in the reindeer herding regions. Go ahead, Anna Maria.
Thank you very much. I don't have a fancy presentation, so you will bear with my face instead. I hope that's fine. I'm very pleased to be here and take part of this seminar on the behalf of the Sami Council, where I'm a project leader for the project Wetlands Sapmi, which is a part of this larger project of Arctic ecosystems. So I would just give you like a short the highlights of the issue today with wetlands and reindeer husbandry. Sami livelihood and traditions depend upon functional ecosystems, and for reindeer husbandry, wetlands are very important. The reindeer husbandry needs both summer and winter pastures for the reindeer. They need migration routes between these areas, calving areas, places for slaughter for the rutting season, places for calf marking, roundups, water supplies, and places for rest and shelter for the reindeer. And all this is found on wetlands. We also need these areas for hunting, for fishing, foraging, and gathering materials for handcraft, etc. And what we see today is a huge fragmentation of the landscape because of all the exploitations that has happened and are happening in Sapmi. We have many active mines, for example. New mines are coming, and there are a few disused mines as well. And none of this land is useful anymore for reindeer husbandry. We also have wind park industries on the land, and it is the same here. This land is more or less useless for reindeer husbandry due to both the fragmentation and destruction it creates in combination with high stress levels for reindeer in nearby areas. And recent research will have shown that it's up to 10 kilometers from these wind park mills that stresses animals. It's quite huge areas. And these are only two examples of direct threat to reindeer husbandry that occurs on the land, and thus also a threat to our livelihood. And the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People has declared that Indigenous people has the right to decide over the traditional lands, but this is not the case in Sapmi. This means that we don't have the possibility to say no to exploitations. And so what is the solution for future reindeer husbandry when the ecosystem is destroyed because of all this? Well, even if Sweden, for example, equate reindeer husbandry as farming and believe that economic compensation and artificial feeding is a solution for decreased and destroyed grazing area, this is not the solution for us. We don't want economic compensation for the land that is destroyed or taken. Reindeer doesn't eat money. They need functional grazing areas, and we want our traditions and culture to survive. The use and the indigenous knowledge of wetlands are priceless, in my opinion, because Sami has used the land for ages and managed it for their livelihood. We mean that this knowledge needs to be included in decision-making when it comes to management of wetlands. Because as we all know, if wetlands aren't functional, we also lose necessary carbon storages. And this will, of course, affect all of us, reindeer herder or not. I look forward to have some questions, and I will be here in the discussion. Thank you very much for me.
Yes, thank you, Ann-Maria. Thank you very much for that input. And yes, we remind you of the Q&A session. You can post your questions there. I found it very interesting what you said in how much the reindeer herders are aware of the ecosystem services, of the services that the ecosystems yield towards their livelihood. And I wonder if it's a much more direct connection, and that's why you with the land, with the ecosystems, and hence you realize the important services. Because I think in our complex, in many parts of the world where it's very densely populated and very complex societies, we've been so removed from these services that we do not realize how important they are until we've potentially even lost them. And so you think that is the case because you are so, there's a direct connection and hence you have the understanding?
That was a very long question.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry,
well,
I actually lost you in a few
Basically,
few
I
points.
think it's very interesting to me that the reindeer herders are aware of the services that the ecosystems yield towards their livelihood. And so you think their way of living is more, the connection between them and the ecosystems is so direct, and hence that's why they understand the value of these services.
Yes, of course, because they are out there, the herders are out there like almost every day, and they see the changes and how it affects the reindeer and the behavior and the nature and everything. So they are the front viewers of what's actually happening, I would say.
Yes, exactly. So maybe that's a key concept there, because so if we increase awareness of the services, then this will become a central concept in terms of all planning and all our land use, if we are aware. So maybe that's the first step, which is in line with what Casey was talking about in terms of mainstreaming that biodiversity is there in all aspects of the planning or use of the land. Yes, so
thought I would jump in with a couple of questions.
Yes, there's a question on, please describe the impacts of wind farms on reindeer. Ann-Maria, you want to comment on that?
Mm-hmm. Of course, I can try at least. Well, first of all, you have, when you're building the wind park farms or the places, you have the destruction of the landscape with roads and everything just to create it. I mean, maybe it could be better if you could just put it from the top of the sky down. You don't have to create all these roads. But then you also have there have been a few research projects examining how the reindeer are behaving around these windmills. And we have a study in Sweden which concluded that the reindeers are getting stressed. And even if there is very good lichen, like in the winter grazing areas, you have good lichen areas where the reindeer usually should feed. You have seen in the study that with GPS collars, you have actually studied this in a very good way. You see that most of the reindeer just walks. They wander. They don't want to stop because they are so heavily impacted from the windmills. And in just 2 weeks from now, we will have a new article coming out looking at exactly the same thing. And they have concluded that it's up to 10 kilometers from a windmill that really affects the reindeer. And if the reindeer doesn't want to stop and feed, there is this inner stress. They are always on the go towards something, looking for other grazing areas. And in with many limitations of good grazing areas, this is a problem. It affects everyone around them, other communities, other reindeer herders. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There's a long question for Casey. You wanna see it in the chat box?
From Federica?
Yes, well, there's a question about, is there a database or preliminary report where one can be better? Yeah, right.
Okay. Yeah, there's, so the first thing I'll mention is that there's an ARF session in 2 weeks on Arctic infrastructure project databasing. So tune back in for that. In terms of our project, we're currently trying to do an assessment of the actual scope geographically of mining throughout the Arctic. So we're looking at developing a map, and we're pulling obviously from a lot of different information, trying to get that into one clean looking visual. But we're trying to put together a map of where the Arctic is, where the Arctic mining is, where the potential mineral sources are, and then potentially overlaying some biodiversity hotspots on that as well. We'll see how that all fits on a map as part of one of our products for phase 2. In terms of actual data management, that was a theme that's come up repeatedly with industry, with NGOs, and with the government agencies that we've talked to on this project, is the need and the interest in potentially collecting data using similar protocols and rolling it up and sharing it into larger databases. And CAF does have the potential to do that as well. So we're thinking about how to do that, but that's a big challenge to take, mining industry data from across the Arctic and share it. It may be more of a local or national effort to do that, but it certainly seems like a need that's been expressed.
I could just toss out a quick question because it seems like we have this question of balancing conservation and use, but there's some kinds of uses that make other kinds of uses impossible or very difficult. That's what I hear Anna Maria discussing, at least in the proximity of either a mine or even wind power. How do we tackle those kinds of issues in a way that is sustainable over a long period of time? And are there examples for ways that those have been better? We have lots of examples of how they've been not so well managed. Are there good examples of ways that balance has been struck in a constructive way?
Well, in my view, I think, and actually I liked your slide there about this sustainable development goals very much, because I think, and like you say, there are some uses that will prevent other uses, like Anne-Maria pointed out. But I think if we have as a baseline the sustainable development goals and take a integrated landscape management approach to things, I think we can then sort of approach or plan the use of the land as we populate areas in the Arctic in a fashion that we maintain as much as we can, or if not all, of the natural resources or the livelihoods or and the biodiversity. So I think that's a needed approach. You cannot just work on one thing or another. You have to take sort of like I say, a landscape level integrated approach where the sustainable development goals are your foundation, what you build on.
Great. There's well, this actually leads us straight into the next session because one of the, right? For us to decide that for local people who use that and to make those decisions from a distance is problematic, to say the least. And what Victoria and Stanislav will talk about a little bit is, or for 20 minutes, is this question of how do you engage local people in the decision-making process, not just to do questionnaires or to inform them about what's happening. But one clear way to to figure out better ways to do this balance is to engage people who really have a stake in it. And so I would like to pass this back over to you, Victoria, and you, Stanislav. Thanks very much. And thank you, Linur and Anna Maria and Casey for your session there.
Thank you, Marcus. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you out there today. My name is Victoria Kutuk-Bushman, and I'm an Inuk wildlife and conservation biologist, originally from the coastal tundra of northern Alaska, in a small town called Ukavik. But I actually live now in the coastal wetlands around Nuuk in Greenland. So like I had just mentioned, I am Inuit, and I do work in a lot in conservation, particularly at the international level, but mostly working with Inuit communities across the north. And today I'm going to actually be sharing a little bit with you my own presentation. Let's go to the first slide. So I got involved in some of this work initially because I had come to do some work for CAF on a project that was related to the wetlands project that Marcus has been talking about, but of course, a little bit different angle. I worked on the Arctic Wetlands and Indigenous Peoples study, which was a circumpolar assessment of how Indigenous communities are engaged in wetlands, in their management and their use. So first of all, I'm just going to bring you to where I'm from. We talked a lot about the science and more of the technical aspects of wetlands and their restoration and conservation, but we haven't talked so much about their biodiversity yet. Wetlands are a significant portion of the Arctic. We all sort of have a little bit of different scales of what is wetlands, what kinds of wetlands. We have different definitions and characteristics by which we define that. But as somebody who comes from the Arctic, I can tell you that most of the Arctic is very wet for some portion of the year. And we have, these ecosystems are probably the most biodiverse of all the Arctic ecosystems, except perhaps the marine Arctic ecosystems. And they are significant to our peoples. I'm from a place that lives quite deeply connected to the landscape. I come from a place that is quite deeply connected to the landscape. And we have places like this where we're going out and we're collecting berries. This is a picture in Iceland. People have been really deeply connected to landscapes all across the Arctic, indigenous, non-indigenous. People have always relied on the resources in wetlands for a number of things. And it's very difficult to separate humans from these landscapes. For instance, I actually live in a protected area. My house is in a protected area, in a wetland, in the capital, and the capital of Greenland is on a wetland. So it's very difficult to say that these are places that we can separate ourselves from. And I do firmly believe that like conservation is very much a social process. Like we know the science, we have a lot of information, and we know that we need to act. But quite honestly, it's often getting people engaged in these processes, right? And transforming science into policy and ensuring that our policies and our management practices are relevant to people's lives. They're culturally relevant, they're possible, they're ethical, and that they're really fully knowledge-based. And so I got involved in this Arctic Wetlands and Indigenous People study as a way of looking at how we can be more engaged with these communities that are living on these landscapes as we're talking more about restoration and conservation more broadly. So this is the report. I'm just showing you the front page of it because you can go and find it on the CAF website if you're really interested and want to see more about it. But I'm going to share a little bit with you about the results from this study that was completed in 2019. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about co-management specifically and what different levels of engagement mean broadly. So we're going to go really quickly through the primary results of this research. The first is that Indigenous communities are deeply, deeply connected to the landscape and at a much higher level than a lot of people realize. So over looking at 35 different protected areas all across the Arctic and all 8 of the Arctic countries, we find that of this surveyed selection, 82.9% of these protected areas are being used directly for things like food security. There's farming, herding, mostly in more in Sapmi and a little bit in Russia. And then there's a lot of gathering, fishing, and hunting all across the board. So this is significant. People are using these landscapes. And this is significant because using these spaces doesn't necessarily mean that we have the ability to engage in those spaces, their management, the policy making around these spaces. And so often Indigenous communities and local communities can be subjected to management and policy that they have had no input in. This is to show that land ownership and management authority across these spaces is, one, very complicated, and two, we're really seeing like Indigenous participation or local participation. I also included communities in Iceland as part of this category just because it was the only country that didn't have a population like that. But we're seeing somewhere between 1/3 and 1/4 of Indigenous and local communities actually have direct input into the management that is being developed for wetlands. And why this is important, this use and this ability to engage in that management, is because we're finding that a lot of times the management plans that are really showing us what are we going to be doing to achieve our conservation targets and goals aren't always accounting for Indigenous and local uses of these resources within that planning process. And so we don't have a complete picture of what is happening on the ground. We don't know what people are doing, what resources they rely on. And this is, of course, not to greater control Indigenous and local uses of resources, but to really have a good idea of what is happening so that we can account for that in our planning processes. The second is that this is a major knowledge gap. So like we have the science, but there are things that we don't have information on. And there are a lot of Indigenous and local communities that have good information who we just haven't been engaged with and who haven't had the opportunity to share that information with us. And that is significant because conservation is much better when we have more information, right? So it's a crisis-based discipline and we need all of the information that we can get. And it's really just, it's a disservice to ourselves as conservationists and as managers that we're not actively going out there and seeking that information. And the last is that we really need to be developing policies and management practices that respect and accommodate these different uses, perhaps uses that we hadn't considered before. You know, hunting of freshwater fishes in wetlands, the hunting of migratory birds, the hunting of migratory mammals. These kinds of things also need to be accurately reflected within our planning processes so that we don't have to unnecessarily inhibit communities from engaging in these landscapes as we achieve our conservation targets and goals. So the last thing that I want to just briefly go over is that in this project, I was starting to develop like an idea of, okay, so like there are these different varying levels of engagement that are independent of any sort of national or regional contexts that really show through within these management processes of these different protected areas. And so I developed sort of a conceptual spectrum that I was really intending only to use for myself, but I find it useful to think about some of these issues. We hear a lot, especially in the US, about consultation, and there are varying different things. We've been talking a lot about co-management, and a lot of people now are starting to talk about co-production. And these activities that here on this spectrum right now on the top are things that people are actively pursuing. We throw around quite a bit. But what I was starting to realize as I was really diving into how these protected areas and these wetlands are managed, that when engagement processes really only accounted for consultation and information sharing, so very like unidirectional flow and exchange of information and ideas, we're seeing much less communication, we're seeing much less trust and external legitimacy. So a lot of people who are living in those spaces or are engaged in those spaces might not see the conservation effort as a legitimate and worthwhile thing to pursue and adhere to. And as we move more into knowledge exchange, which is more bidirectional, co-management, which is, you know, prioritizing and developing strategies collaboratively, and then of course co-production, which is an entirely different level of intensity in this regard. As we go this way, we do have a lot more authority sharing, decision-making power, sovereignty for indigenous communities, and the one that I really would like to point out is this robustness of evidence. Like, as an indigenous person, I recognize that like there is a moral imperative and there are like certain responsibilities about conservation that we need to be aware of, but even setting those aside, conservation efforts are better. We better achieve our targets and goals when there is a robustness of evidence, when we really have that science and that indigenous knowledge and that local knowledge and that experiential knowledge. Like, we need all of that in order to do a good job. And so the way that we can make sure that we have more of that information is to make sure that we're going more to the right in the spectrum, and really, really trying to achieve ultimately co-productive or indigenous and local community-led conservation initiatives that are really coming from the bottom up. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend and colleague, Stanislav, who is calling very, very late from Russia. So I'm going to exit out of this somehow. Yes, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Stas, are you here with us? Are you able to come on?
Yeah, I will try my best. Yeah.
Perfect.
I hope it works. Can you see my screen?
I think you need to double click there.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry.
Is it stuck there, Stanislav?
Yeah,
there
yeah.
You go. Good.
Okay. So hello everyone from Siberia. It's really early morning, and yeah. And thank you, first of all, thank you for having me here at the Arctic Resilient Forum. This is really interesting and important session of indigenous co-management and engagement. So, sorry. I can't. Yeah. So my name is Stanislav, and I come from the Republic of Sakha-Yakutia in northeastern Siberia, and it is the largest region in Russia, and the most, or even the whole territory, is covered by wetlands. So we have tundra, forest tundra, and taiga, and our region is inhabited by many indigenous peoples: Aveni, Evenki, Dolgan, Sakha, Chukchi, Yukagirs, and we all are highly dependent on ecosystem services for food, for shelter, for clothes, for transportation, for cultural and spiritual well-being, as well as social cohesion. And so our main traditional activities are fishing, hunting, gathering, reindeer herding, cattle breeding, and also we use ecosystem service from medicinal reasons. But however, due to many changes, including climatic, environmental, socio-political, as well as extractive industries, socio-ecological systems are highly deteriorated. And for example, due to climate change, due to floods and forest fires, social-ecological systems. For example, new species may shift their habitats to other areas, and they may force out native species. Or, for example, fish tend to go down to the river bottom due to warming waters, or forest fires, as I mentioned, and floods. They they may deteriorate traditional activities such as fishing or hay harvesting or reindeer grazing fields. So reindeer may change its migration routes. And another important issue in our land is socio-political transformations, like fishing regulations, which were established and designed without taking into account local and indigenous knowledge. And people were complaining that these regulations are not appropriate, and they are not, they don't fit into local conditions. Or another issue, very important and main issue in our region is our extractive industries. These industries sometimes also grab lands, and they do not consider local indigenous people's interests. And yeah, so, and I'm not an expert in co-management, but I tried to research some mechanisms and some strategies which are being done at the moment in our republic. So there is no indigenous co-management strategy in our republic, but all conditions exist to be established. And our republic, our region, is one of the first regions in Russia to carry out ethno-cultural impact assessment of extractive industries. So before establishing the activities in a given region, in a given district, this industry should carry out impact assessment on how the activity will impact ethno or cultural, social or environmental conditions of a given community. Mechanisms of benefit sharing and corporate social responsibilities developed and implemented in our region, but unfortunately they did it only partially. The Ministry of Nature Protection of our republic monitors lands and water bodies, and usually they report annually about the conditions. However, some regulations, unfortunately, do not take into account indigenous knowledge, and only few scientific research is conducted over the last years. So what should be done? According to my research and according to some accounts, co-management strategy should be established in the future to involve more indigenous communities, because indigenous communities possess quite high environmental ethics, and they know there is a knowledge of how to sustainably use land. And it is also important to consider indigenous knowledge in policy-making processes, because indigenous communities know the local conditions, and they know changes that are occurring in the moment. And this should be all policy-making process should always involve indigenous communities' knowledge. Third, when establishing extractive activities, indigenous communities' interests should be considered, because because we are stakeholders and we are actors in these lands, and they are our homelands. And also, this should be improved. Benefit sharing should be improved, and corporate social responsibility mechanisms also should be improved in the future. And all extractive industries should be obliged to conduct impact assessment, because there is a statistic that only, for example, from 2015 up to date, only 10 companies have been have conducted impact assessment out of 200. And indigenous communities should be also involved in establishing conservation parks. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thanks, Stanislav. Looking at the, and to you too, Victoria. Looking at the clock here, I'm gonna take my chair responsibility and jump in and raise just a couple of points. And then, since part of our goal here is to think a little bit about what are our action options to boost wetland restoration and stewardship as a priority, and to channel some of that effort through the institutions that are part of this process: CAF, SDWG, Arctic Council, national governments. I am going to raise just a couple of points, and then I want to bounce it over to Tatiana and to Jennifer and Tom Barry, who are the executive secretaries of SDWG and CAF, respectively. So just a quick point, it's really clear that there's a lot of importance, but also a lot of struggle in having local engagement, local and indigenous engagement. There's some really difficult balancing to be done. One of the first comments talked about people in Anwar, for example, who see the Arctic in that region as both a source of riches and a homeland. And so that kind of balancing act is obviously a very delicate one, but it becomes even more important when it has the global consequences connected to biodiversity and connected to climate change. So we need to think through how to do that. And a lot of this balancing is going to happen at the very local level. So Tatiana, do you want to do a couple of minutes quick wrap up, and then we pass it over to Jennifer and Tom and ask, how do we take this forward?
Yeah, sure, Marcus. Thank you very much. This great question. Thank you very much for the discussion. I was busy typing answers, but hope this slide can help to go ahead. But I think that first of all, my message would be, yes, this is the decade, UN decade of ecosystem restoration, coming 2021, 2030. And I would like to bring your attention that it's not only planting trees as we see in the TV. Yeah, ecosystem restoration is restoration of different ecosystems. And please, when you hear about ecosystem restoration, think about wetlands in Arctic. This is possible, this is needed, and this is helpful for us. Besides this, about resilience and wetlands. Yeah, we can't anymore use, even if the poll have some of these answers, use technical solutions to oppose and to face the climate change. We can't take all humankind to the artificial glass house. Yeah, we have to live on this planet, and we need ecosystems to help us. We can't do it ourselves. We are not anymore so clever and so prominent, and we have not enough our human focused solutions. We need to understand, like already Aldo Leopold told us in the beginning of the 20th century, we are a part of ecosystems. We have to live as a part of ecosystem, and we have to help ecosystem to help us. Otherwise, it will not work. And please, follow this advice that think globally and act locally. Learn about these global mechanisms like climate change, biodiversity conservation, and other stuff. Yeah, to enhance the needs and to enhance the significance of your community. Yeah, you have to explain your local governments, your local folks, that making this job, you are contributing globally. Yeah, not only for yourself, but globally. But do it from the incentives from yourself, from the community, from societies, as we saw what Victoria and Stanislav were explaining us. So thank you very much, really, for joining us. I see this is very many people, and we hope that our messages can touch you. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tatiana. Let me just wrap with a couple of points here. Social resilience is dependent on ecosystem resilience, and social resilience is dependent upon people's engagement. So the question over to Tom and Jennifer is, how do we channel that engagement through the two key working groups in this process into the Arctic Council and the Arctic states? All yours.
All Tom's.
Okay. Hi, everyone. This initiative that we've been referring to in the course of this session today, the Wetlands initiative that CAF is working on in cooperation with the Belmont Forum, is the first time that the Arctic Council has in any significant way looked at wetlands issues, at least when it comes to biodiversity. And I think to ensure that the Council continues to keep this on its agenda and the Arctic states might actually take action on some of the issues that have been discussed here, I think there's two steps that we should look at to try and embed this within the Arctic Council structure and the two working groups that we're discussing here, CAF and SDWG. And the first is that through the current CAF Wetlands Initiative on resilience, we're developing a series of key findings and policy recommendations on wetlands that will be delivered for the ministerial meeting that the Council is holding in May of next year. And I think, and those recommendations are being developed with many of the people on the call here and in cooperation with the Belmont Forum Wetlands Initiative. So I think it's important that we ensure that those policy recommendations, when they go to the Council, reflect the need that whatever actions the Council takes, it shouldn't just be purely on an ecosystem biodiversity basis, but should include a human dimension and should, have a more holistic approach to how we approach this. And I think it's important to have that reflected in those recommendations, because they will go to the meeting of the foreign ministers in May. They'll be hopefully endorsed or approved, and that will give us then a mandate to start to see how we can actually look at the issues that have been raised here and find constructive steps to take it forward. And the second way that we consider to look at this relates to the global biodiversity framework that's currently under development. The Arctic Council has just started now through CAF development of a new action plan for how it addresses biodiversity. And that action plan will be developed over the next 2 years, and it'll be developed so it fits in with the biodiversity goals and targets as defined in this new UN Global Biodiversity Framework. And I think the policy recommendations are referred to, and the outcomes of this session and other meetings we've been having on wetlands should be used to inform aspects of that action plan, so to make sure that it refers to the importance of this issue and identifies concrete tasks and things that we should encourage or we should promote through that framework. And by addressing some of these issues, both in those policy recommendations and that action plan that's starting to be developed, then I think that will help us embed wetlands issues, restoration and degradation and so on within the Council's agenda. And it will help both Jennifer through the SDWG and myself through CAF to help ensure that these issues continue to be addressed in a more holistic way as well. So it's not just done in a silo looking at purely human aspects, or so it's looking at an integrated way.
Yeah, I'll just add to that very quickly. I think Tom's done a great job, but I'm actually struck, Marcus, by a comment that you made when we were preparing for this session, which is that wetlands is 10 years behind plastics in terms of profile. And I guess the question becomes is what can the SCWG and CAF and the other working groups within the Arctic Council do to raise the profile of this and to do it in a way that sort of really shows the integrated nature of this. And I think we've shown that that is possible, and that we in wetlands and the interconnectedness and mining, another example that was used here today, and sort of looking at how we bring together the ecosystem piece of it and the social piece of it is so critical. And you know, it's about continuing the conversation, and that's why I think resilience is such a valuable tool, because it gives us a lens by which to really acknowledge those interconnections. And so I think this conversation combined with others really sort of help to amplify the need to keep that conversation going. So thank you so much to this group for the work that they've done to really do that. I'm really struck by the importance of thinking about how our framing of issues really draws out different perspectives, and how we value ecosystems, as Marcus said at the beginning, will also inform what we take out of the conversation. And we've really seen a rich conversation of that. I want to remind everyone that I know we've had some amazing questions, and we haven't had a chance to get to all of them, that there is a Slack channel where this conversation can continue, and I encourage you to be part of that. And I just also want to encourage you to keep being part of the conversation. We're going to be talking about financing resilience next week, and everybody knows that at the end of the day, the conversation we don't want to have is about money, because there's so many sticking points. So we're going to try and tackle this hard nut in our conversation next week, and we hope you'll join us for that conversation. So thanks again to everybody, and to our speakers and to our participants, and we'll see you next week. Bye.